I'm going to read Chapter 20, titled Pan and the Nymphs, from Stories of Old Greece and Rome by Emilie Kip Baker, spelled Emilie Kip Baker. Emilie Kip Baker, born 1873, died 1951. This book was first published in 1913. This material is okay to be listened to by children. Pan and the Nymphs. Pan, the god of woods and fields, god of the flocks and herds, and patron deity of all shepherds, was said to be the son of Mercury. It is apparently not known who his mother was, but she must have had some sylvan blood in her veins, for the youthful Pan showed every evidence of having been born of woodland creatures, as he had the pointed ears of the fawns, and the horns and goat's legs of the satyrs. The story goes that his mother, whichever nymph it was of the many reputed to have borne him, was disgusted with his absurd appearance, and refused to own him for her child. But Mercury was delighted with his son's grotesque figure, and took him to Olympus to amuse the gods. Pan's favorite dwelling place was Arcadia, and here he wandered over the hills and among the rocks, or roamed through the fertile valleys. He delighted in hunting, and amused himself with various pastimes, his especial pleasure being to lead in the dances with the nymphs. He was devoted to music, and was usually seen playing on the syrinx, or shepherd's pipes, which he himself invented, and named from a nymph whom he unsuccessfully wooed. The maiden Syrinx was a follower of Diana, and one day, as she was returning from the chase, she met Pan, who immediately fell in love with her beauty, and begged her to be his wife. The nymph had always scorned to listen to any lover, and Pan's appearance did not tend to soften her objections. So while he was praising her many charms and pleading for her love, she turned and ran away. The woodland god was not to be put off so lightly, however, and he promptly gave chase to the fleeing maiden, who, finding that her pursuer was gaining on her, called wildly on the river nymphs for help. She had by this time reached the water's edge, and just as Pan's arms were about to enfold her, the kindly nymphs changed her into a cluster of reeds. The god was much chagrined at the failure of his hopes, but since he could not have the living maiden, he determined to take whatever remained of the beautiful thing that had charmed him. So he gathered a bunch of the reeds, and after cutting them into unequal lengths, bound them together into a sort of shepherd's pipes. When he put the reeds to his lips, they gave forth the softest and most plaintive tones, and Pan called them the syrinx in honor of the nymph. Before inventing this new instrument, Pan had always played upon the flute, and it was his skill in this direction that made King Midas dare to affront Apollo by declaring Pan to be the better musician. The god of woods and fields was not, however, a frequenter of palaces, but made his home in grottos and piped to the murmuring trees. He loved to prowl by night in lonesome places, and lurk among the shadows, where some belated traveler, startled by the weird hoot of an owl, would see his grotesque form and rush away, filled with that unreasoning terror called a panic. Pan's partners in the sylvan dance were the wood nymphs, who always welcomed him and his followers. When his days were spent among the mountain solitudes, the Oreads, or mountain nymphs, danced with him in the moonlight, and when he preferred to live in the valleys, the Dryads, or nymphs of vegetation, joined in the revels led by Pan and his company of fauns and satyrs. The Naiades, the beautiful water nymphs who dwelt in the clear depths of the fountains, did not come out of their quiet haunts to take part in the merriment. Nor did the Hamadryads leave the safe shelter of their trees to mingle in the joyous dance. Among these latter nymphs, each had her particular tree, and lived and died with the one entrusted to her care. It was held, therefore, to be an act of wanton cruelty to destroy or even mar a tree, lest the Hamadryad who inhabited it should be hurt and possibly killed. It was unwise to break off a flower recklessly, or to pull it rudely from the earth, for in this humble form might be lodged the spirit of some woodland creature. Such a sad mistake did Dryope once make, and suffered for her carelessness by being changed from a mortal into a Hamadryad. Dryope was a beautiful young princess, the wife of Andraemon, and the mother of a golden-haired boy. Every day she carried her child to a small lake near the palace, and let him gather the gaily colored flowers that grew on the water's edge. One day, as she wandered by the lake, Dryope saw a lotus blossom and pointed it out to her little son, who immediately tried to pluck it. As it was much beyond his reach, his mother leaned over the water and broke it off the stem. To her surprise, she saw drops of blood slowly oozing from the stem, and as the boy eagerly grasped the lovely flower in his chubby hand, a crimson stream trickled through his clasped fingers. He dropped the blossom with a frightened cry and ran screaming to the palace, while Dryope stood looking down bewildered at the bleeding flower. Just then she heard a voice telling her that she had killed the nymph Lotus, who, to escape from the arms of the hateful god Priapus, had taken the form of a lotus. When Dryope realized the dreadful thing that she had unknowingly done, she turned pale with fright and would have hurried away from the unlucky spot. But when she tried to turn from the sight of the dying flower, she found that she could not move. Her feet seemed rooted to the ground, and as she looked down, she was horrified to see that a rough bark was beginning to enclose her limbs. With dreadful rapidity it spread upward, and soon encircled her whole body, while her arms changed into twisted branches and her hands into green leaves. In vain she called to her husband and her friends for help. When they arrived, there was nothing left of the fair Dryope but her tear-stained face, which was covered all too soon by the cruel bark. Just before she disappeared completely from their sight, she begged that her little son might be taught to play beneath her branches. And when, in all the after days, the boy sat willingly beside the tree and listened to the soft rustling of its leaves, the passers-by would say, "Dryope is whispering to her child." The danger of recklessly destroying any tree is shown by the story of Eresicthon, who dared to defy the goddess Ceres, and so received a fitting punishment. There was a certain grove of trees sacred to Ceres, and among them was a lofty oak on which votive tablets were often hung, and around which the nymphs and dryads danced hand in hand. Eresicthon ordered his servants to cut down this venerable oak, and when they hesitated, telling him that it was a tree beloved by Ceres and should not suffer such a sacrilege, he seized the axe himself and made a deep gash in the trunk. To the great horror of those who stood by, blood began to flow from the wound, and as Eresicthon was about to deal the tree another blow, one of his servants caught at his arm, imploring him not to touch the oak again, for the blood showed that a Hamadryad was being wounded. Maddened at this interference, and determined to carry out his brutal will, Eresicthon declared that he would cut down the tree if by doing so he killed a dozen dryads. He lifted his axe for a mighty stroke, and as the servant again sought to stay his arm, he turned fiercely and killed the man with one swift blow. Then he proceeded to fell the tree, and soon it was lying, bruised and bleeding, on the ground. The nymphs rushed to Ceres and begged her to punish this wicked violation of her grove. The goddess promised that Aristocon's deed should not go unpunished, and sent an Oread to the remote part of Scythia, where the ice lies thick on the dreary soil, and the land is always desolate. Here dwell drowsy cold and paleness and shuddering and dreadful famine. When the Oread drew near this barren country, she saw far off the gaunt form of Famine pulling up with her teeth and claws the scant bits of vegetation that could be found here and there in the frozen earth. The nymph did not want to linger near the dreadful form of Famine, lest the hag should reach out her lean finger and touch the maiden's robes, so she hurriedly delivered the message of Ceres and sped back quickly to her own fair land of Thessaly. Not daring to disobey the goddess's command, Famine left her dreary country and sought out the home of Erysichthon. She found him asleep, and as he slept, she enfolded him with her wings, and breathed into his nostrils her deadly breath. Then she returned to her frantic digging in the unyielding soil. When Erysichthon awoke, he was at once consumed with a fierce desire for food, but however much he ate, the terrible craving never ceased. All day long he devoured things greedily, but at night his hunger was still unsatisfied. His servants piled up food in enormous quantities before him, but the gnawing pains of hunger never left him. He spent all his wealth in a vain attempt to buy enough food to appease the insatiable monster within him. But though he at last sold all that he had, even to his house and clothing, it was not enough to buy him the food he craved. There was nothing left now but his daughter, and frenzied by hunger he offered to sell her to a slave dealer. The girl pitied her father's sufferings and would have done anything to help him, but she resented his baseness in selling her, for she came of a noble race. While her purchaser was disputing with her father over the price, the maiden, who was standing on the seashore, a short distance away from her new master, implored Neptune to save her from the disgrace of being sold as a slave. The kindly sea god heard her cry, and changed her into an old fisherwoman. When the bargain between Erysichthon and the dealer was settled, the man looked around for his new purchase, but she was nowhere to be seen. The only person on the seashore, besides the brutal bargainers, was an old woman who sat mending her net. The irate owner searched in vain for his slave, and even asked the fisherwoman if she had seen a weeping maiden. Unable to find the girl, he at last went away, concluding that Erysichthon's daughter had tried to escape, and so had been drowned in the sea. The maiden was rejoiced at her deliverance, but her cruel father, on seeing her regain her own form, decided that this was an easy way of making the money he desperately needed. So he sold his daughter again and again, and each time she sought the help of Neptune, who obligingly turned her into many different shapes. At last even this device failed to bring Erysichthon enough money to meet the ever-increasing demands of his hunger. In despair over the lack of food, he began to eat his own flesh, and in a short time he had devoured so much of his body that death came to end his torment. So Ceres was avenged. The Hamadryads were seldom seen by men, but people knew them to be both gentle and beautiful. That they could repay a kindness is well shown by the story of Rhoecus, who gained the love of one of the shyest of these nymphs. One day the youth happened to see an oak tree bent so far down by the wind that some of its branches were already broken. He propped up the tree and gently bound up the broken limbs. Then, as he turned to go, he heard a soft voice calling him. It was the Hamadryad who had expected to die with her stricken tree, and was now so grateful to Rhoecus that she bade him ask of her any reward she wished. The youth boldly asked for her love, and the nymph reluctantly yielded to his wish, promising to meet him at the oak tree each day just before sunset. To keep him mindful of the hour set for the tryst, she told him that she would send him a messenger, a bee, which would also guide him to the spot where she was waiting. Rhoecus was very happy with the Hamadryad, and never failed to follow the flight of the bee that came each day at sunset to lead him to the trysting place. One morning, however, he began to play at dice with his friends, and the game continued through the long summer afternoon. As it drew toward sunset, Rhoecus forgot that it was his hour to meet the Dryad, and continued his game, even though he noticed vaguely that a bee was buzzing near him. Soon the bee came close to his face and buzzed so persistently that Rhoecus brushed it angrily away. Each time he tried to shake it off, it came buzzing back, and at last he struck at it so viciously that it fell to the ground. Then in a flash, Rhoecus remembered his promise to the Dryad, and throwing away his dice, he hurried to the trysting place. He called to the nymph and begged her to come to him once more. But no sweet face appeared, though a voice spoke from the heart of the oak tree, bidding him a sad farewell. Rhoecus had already repented bitterly of his forgetfulness, but nothing could restore him to favor. He sat all night beside the oak tree, but the Dryad never came to him again. End of Pan and the Nymphs.